And people who didn't find parking and they're still looking, well, they're just not going to see the beginning, that's all. All right, everyone, good evening and welcome to the February USC Master of Professional Writing Student Faculty Reading Event. My name is Caron Tate. I'm the coordinator of the reading series. This is my second year in the program, and I will be your host for the evening. This is kind of an interesting... Thank you. So let's see. Let me turn this maybe a little, since we kind of, it's this kind of thing going on. Okay. All right. Okay. Now that's more like it. Now we can kind of see everybody. So we would like to thank Jennifer Ramos and Book Soup for having us in this evening, and staff. Thank you so much. And thank you also to Corey, who is filming it for us, and it will be on the MPW YouTube page, so everybody can go and look at it. A few reminders, please turn off your noisemakers, whatever they are. However, if you want to tweet, Facebook, update your social media, please do. So, just let me know when you're doing it. Okay, at the moment, the restrooms, still out, or? Okay, so we're restroom challenged at the moment, and now that I've told you, of course, everybody's gonna have to, but that situation may go away, so I will keep you apprised. As many of you know, the inspiration for this year's overall theme was Mad Libs, and we incorporated that into Joan Didion's Year of Magical Thinking to come up with the Year of Mad Lib Thinking. Each month we've chosen titles and quotes from a few famous writers to have some fun with. And tonight we are featuring poet, novelist, playwright, and journalist Langston Hughes, born February 1st, 1902. And you might be familiar with these lines from one of his most famous works. What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, or fester like a sore and then run? Does it stink like rotten meat, or crust and sugar over, like a syrupy sweet? Maybe it just sags like a heavy load, or does it explode? That is from Hughes' Bookland poem suite, and it was called Montage of a Dream Deferred, and you probably, I'm sure, are familiar with A Raisin in the Sun, and that's where that title came from. We've asked our readers if they did a new version of Hughes' book, how they would complete Montage of a blank, deferred, and what their book might be about. Hughes is quoted as saying, an artist must be free to choose what he does, certainly, but he must also never be afraid to do what he might choose. So we've asked our readers to tell us about some things they or any artist shouldn't be afraid to do. And because for many, February is the month of love, our other featured writer is Anais Nin, born February 21st, 1903. Anais, who, by the way, was born Angela Anais Juana Antolina Rosa Eldemira Nin y Culmel, was a novelist, essayist, and journalist. But she was best known for her groundbreaking erotica, including, who knows the name of it?
Delta of Venus.
The Delta of Venus, yeah. Which, we should all take a look at. Anais once said, life shrinks or expands in proportion to one's courage. So we've asked our writers to tell us what their lives shrink or expand in proportion to. Our 5 student readers and special faculty reader, Richard Rayner.
Yeah.
Yeah, he's here. Have all finished these Mad Libs in their own mad way. So we look forward to hearing what they have to say. Let's get started. Our first reader tonight is Patrick Rosenquist. He's in his first year in the program with a nonfiction concentration. Patrick's book would be Montage of a Family, Deferred, which he says would be about his family. There's addiction, fights, and death. Patrick says it would be a little less eloquent than Eugene O'Neill, but he would make sure to still fit in a paternity test. Patrick's life shrinks and expands in proportion with LA's public transit system, so I guess sometimes it just kind of breaks down. He says that we may not know he has a twin brother, but they don't even look related. Paternity test. So everyone, Patrick Rosenquist.
Hello. This is part of a larger work about my family's history, and in particular it's about one relative of mine. It doesn't have a title, and it ends kind of suddenly, so I apologize for that. I stop reading and just walk away. I am the great-great-grandnephew of Chicago's most notorious gay mobster, but I can't prove it. I can say my family thinks he's a relative, and that we're married to his story of bad politics, and that I alone think he was gay, but I can't compress these myths into facts. I can't even pin down his name. He was Alderman John Coughlin, Bathhouse John, and most ominously, the Bath. My family has a preference, and we tell people our political heritage includes a Bathhouse John. No one mistakes him for a bureaucrat. My cousin just made a film about gangsters in Chicago. He plays Bathhouse John, as my mom's family, the Lanes, imagines him. Crisp suit, Tommy gun in hand, permanent scowl underneath the bowler. He's a man who would look at the single-digit body count for the Valentine's Day Massacre and ask, "That's it?" Chicago is a city with painful and violent memories. Over the years, they have been reworked into Genesis myths by thousands of Irish families that invariably see themselves, now in the suburbs, as ranch house Kennedys. My family sees Coughlin as our Joseph P., a self-made trickster with street in his blood, and to man up the whole venture, a thug who shed blood on the streets. I have a different take. Coughlin was born in 1860 in an Irish neighborhood just southwest of downtown Chicago. He was 11 when the Great Fire obliterated the city. The blaze started a few blocks south of his house. It jumped the southern branch of the Chicago River and, guided by denser developments, curled around his neighborhood. 3 years later, when the city was in the midst of a miraculous recovery, Coughlin dropped out of school. In the recently rebuilt downtown, 15-year-old Coughlin began working as a masseuse at the Palmer House Baths. City officials were doling out construction contracts to developers, and this bathhouse was Chicago's finest smoke-filled room. Coughlin began saving tips and betting on horse races. He amassed a small fortune. His charm and flamboyance won him important contacts. John quit the bathhouse. In 1893, he was voted alderman of the First Ward. He represented the area in the city council. Coughlin became close with Hinky-Dink Mike Kenna, another alderman from the Irish ghetto. He was short and angry. Kenna owned a saloon near the baths. When Coughlin took control of the First Ward, its reputation as a hotbed for corruption, violence, and prostitution was already firmly established. Under Bathhouse and Hinky-Dink, its notoriety mushroomed. Coughlin and Kenna had a heated but close relationship. Even though they were inseparable, they would denounce each other in print and public. They were known as Lords of the Levee, or the Grey Wolves, two men with endless contacts, always open to bribery and flatter. Later in life, they parted ways. Coughlin remained alderman until his death in 1938, but for the last 15 years of his life, he was a recluse. During his absence, his reputation for flamboyance grew. After his death, his story receded. He became a footnote in Chicago history. Today, his ward encompasses bits of the Loop and South Loop, which is most of downtown Chicago. Before it gentrified, I remember driving through the area with my dad. We would hear gunshots ring throughout the abandoned warehouses and empty streets. When I was in high school, interested in my family's Chicago history, I'd asked to visit the former First Ward. My parents always said no. My mom was confused by my obsession with Coughlin. She always told me her family was just Irish trash. I took it as a deflection. I went to a Catholic school just outside the city limits, Fenwick Preparatory. My sophomore theology class culminated with a genealogy report. The goal was to pinpoint when your family converted to Catholicism. This is ludicrous because every Catholic family has been so since the invention of guilt. Being gay at a conservative Catholic school was not fun. Projects like the genealogy report terrified me. Speeches meant I had to wade through my mannerisms and inflections. My project was about Bathhouse John. I was reading about his life and thought it could be a fun and mercifully quick presentation. I remember going through the speech and half-consciously removing words that could break into a lisp. Bathhouse John owned an elephant named Princess Alice, and when it became sick, Coughlin instructed his caretakers to feed it whiskey. It's part of the project. Some words are more problematic than others. Princess Alice is supposed to sound feminine, so I could keep it. Sick has a grimy hiss, and the sliding kick of whiskey was dangerous territory. So I reworked Coughlin's life. He published a book of poetry called Ballads of the Bathhouse, and he dedicated it to his political partner, Hinky Dink. All those details have a limp-wristed bounce, so I simply stated that Coughlin published, with heft and steady bursts, a book of poems. I found him fascinating. It was proof that my family, despite what my mom said, was more than Irish trash. At one point, we had been powerful Irish trash. But the real reason I was fascinated with Coughlin became clear when I mumbled my way through the speech. When I read the summary of his life aloud, it was obvious that my great-great-uncle, Bathhouse John, was undeniably and thoroughly gay. In 1912, John Coughlin published a list of Chicago's 10 most handsome men. The Tribune printed pictures of each one, adorning every oval portrait with a title and a name. An adjacent article explained, following the lead of Mrs. Pauline Palmer, who Saturday picked out the 10 most beautiful women in Chicago, John Coughlin, sometimes known as Bathhouse John, yesterday named 10 prominent Chicago men he thinks most deserving of the appellation handsome. The article goes on. His selections, while they may not be pleasing to the feminine mind, incorporate all those points which Mr. Coughlin thinks essential. In his own words, I am not strong for the sissy men. I like a square eye and a square jaw. Of course, with women, but Mr. Coughlin explained no further. Coughlin was not a smart man. His biographer, Lloyd Wendy, always emphasizing the improbability of Coughlin's career, quotes his political philosophy after reminding readers he crystallized his leanings after 4 decades in office and learning the meaning of the word philosophy. Never quarrel, never feud. Ain't much difference between a big and a small man. One's lucky, that's all. Despite his shortcomings, Coughlin was well liked. He was a fiend for publicity, and his later years tried to transition from public servant to poet. He would strong-arm the Chicago Tribune into printing his more polished pieces. Once his work was widely read, Chicagoans would write shoddy limericks and send them into the Tribune under his name. Even though they openly mocked the alderman, Coughlin allowed this to continue. It expanded his repertoire. In 1921, he published an ode to suspenders. This poem is terrible, just so you know. The world is full of four-flushers that are only just pretenders. They aren't nearly as important as to a man his suspenders. At Christmas, we give bonuses to support our borders, so let us men wear galoshes to support our trousers. Coughlin, summing up his fascination, just said, just consider for a moment where civilization would be if someone hadn't invented the suspender.
Okay.
While he wasn't known for his political rigor or for his wit, his conciliatory approach and connections guided him from his time as a teenage organizer to his long twilight as an old guard Democrat. He made politics work in the city that works. He played along with the big men and the small guys, all drawn by wild Western opportunity. He was trustworthy and he was devoted. He named his first racehorse, a stunning prize winner, My Queen, for Mary Kiley, his fiancée. Wendy, his biographer, says Coughlin was rarely romantic, delaying talk of marriage, speaking only of business and politics. But this grand act won the favor of Mary's family. They blessed the marriage, which was an assumed arrangement since Mary and John were barely 10. Coughlin and Kiley were childhood neighbors. They came from large Irish families. They had no honeymoon, and they had no children. Coughlin was also an unwavering Democrat. He spent his teens scraping together a career campaigning for Carter Harrison, the mayor of Chicago at the time, during his unsuccessful run for governor. As a low-level community organizer, Coughlin would crank out buttons that said CHH and distribute them to drunken people. He taught them bad songs about Republicans. Harrison's sell-side contracts were impressed. Coughlin was dependable. A few years later, in the midst of the triumphant thrall of the Chicago World's Fair, a mentally ill Irish immigrant shot Harrison. The man who had never met the mayor was convinced that if he had voted for Harrison, he would secure himself a lucrative cabinet position. The closing ceremony of the World's Fair was canceled. Harrison Street, named after Carter, now runs straight through Coughlin's former First Ward. And that's it.
We start with a gay gangster. We like that. Thank you, Patrick. Our next reader is Bryce Glenn, and Bryce is in his second year with a fiction concentration. Now, Bryce says about the Hughes book, and I'm quoting here, "I wouldn't rewrite that book. It sounds like a good book. I don't think Mr. Hughes would like me rewriting his book." Unquote. And on the subject of artist fears, Bryce tells us he doesn't think artists should be afraid of snakes. They are just quadruple amputee lizards. I'm just saying what Bryce said. And the other thing is what we may not know about Bryce is we may not know how many fingers Bryce has. It's 10, but he's pretty sure no one in the audience ever counted. Okay, now you may meet him, Bryce Glenn.
Hello, everybody. Thank you for coming out. I was going to read something funny, and then I sort of changed my mind later, so here we go. I did this because I simply don't have enough to live for. Case closed. It's an odd experience to sift through a dead man's things in his house, opening dresser drawers to see neatly folded clothes, finding unused keepsakes in old boxes, and inventorying the items to take and those to leave behind. You discover a lot about a person this way. I can't imagine many people knew that my uncle, James Stark Jr., or Jim as he preferred, had no less than 3 books on bookkeeping in his vast library, despite having no apiaries, a harmonica with handwritten tablature for Beatles songs, and soap in his bathrooms that he'd made himself. We found the soap-making kit in a closet. In his kitchen he had laid out his binders that contained annotated recipes for a cookbook no one knew he was working on. It was meticulously prepared, divided into sections, each recipe with sources and notes, and he even had a rejected recipes section that contained recipes like a chicken parmesan that was scrapped with the note, "This recipe is rejected because of the carrots in the tomato sauce. There is something wrong with that." To an outsider, he might seem like a recluse, an eccentric shut-in. I don't believe this to be the case. In the early 90s, he got a job at a company called Sterling Software. He was a computer systems analyst. One of his earlier projects was working in conjunction with JPL on the Magellan Project to map the surface of Venus. They mapped 98% of the planet. There was a framed poster of Venus in his home office, signed with personal notes of congratulations to him from the team he worked with. Later, Sterling was acquired by Northrop Grumman, an American aerospace and defense technology company, and he bounced around from project to project within the company that led him to working with NASA, the Department of Defense, and Homeland Security. For this, he had to obtain a high-level security clearance, where he was subjected to rigorous personal conduct requirements and even the occasional lie detector test. Among his personal effects was his security clearance contract with documents detailing counterintelligence threats and how to safeguard against them. I think he was a spy, my mother told me. While probably not an actual spy, he likely dealt with a very high level of government information and was very mindful of its safekeeping. I think this, coupled with his meticulous nature, led him to be wary of unknown persons. When I was 16, I spent a week with Jim. At the time, he worked for the Department of Defense and lived in Vienna, Virginia. My grandfather, his father, wanted me to see his alma mater, Grove City College in Pennsylvania, and Jim happily volunteered to show me. He was a large man, about 6'3", and despite being a cross-country runner in high school and rail thin for most of his life, in his later years he filled out. We drove around Pennsylvania and Virginia in his electric blue Camaro, me being the boy wonder to his Batman. In addition to the college campus, he took me to several notable places, including the D.C. Mall, Gettysburg, Jamestown, and Williamsburg. Regardless of his Californian blood, he loved the D.C. area and the history of it, always illuminating me to little bits of trivia in the places we explored. He had this laugh where his voice would get high-pitched with a childlike hee-hee-hee giggle. We both had a very dry sense of humor and connected on film as well. Since you're curious, his top 10 desert island films were Almost Famous, Band of Brothers, Blade Runner, The Director's Cut, Bridge on the River Kwai, Casablanca, The Godfather, The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly, The Graduate, North by Northwest, and One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. I know this because he kept extensive lists of what he considered first-tier, second-tier, residual, and worth-a-look films that numbered into the hundreds. I can't imagine how many bad films he had seen that didn't make the cut. I also know this because he sent his film list to my mother for me about a month and a half before he killed himself. Don't you think it's a little weird for him to send these? My mother asked me when she gave them to me. I figured it was just his way of saying hello. See, Jim had distanced himself from the family in the few prior years. He quit his job to get a technical master's degree and had to sell his house to afford it. The family didn't seem to agree with his course of action and tried to push him in another direction. He withdrew to avoid the conflict, convinced he was right. I emailed him shortly after receiving his list to thank him and give him an update on my life. We emailed back and forth, once or twice a week, mostly about film. I later found out he'd been out of work for 3 months before his death. Whether he had quit or was fired is unknown. One of the emails he sent requested contact information for me and my brother. Seeing as Christmas was approaching, I figured he wanted to send something, so I obliged. I planned on sending him a bottle of scotch and a copy of the book City of Thieves. Since this new contact information was reflected in his will, I imagined that he had already made up his mind to end his life at this point or earlier. His messages had no hint of this intent. I last contacted him the night before Thanksgiving with my final message being, I, for one, don't particularly give a shit about Thanksgiving, but should you care for it more than I, then I wish you a happy Thanksgiving. He shot himself on a hiking trail in Whitney State Forest 2 days later. The detective, referring to the weather at the time of his death, later relayed to me it was a beautiful day. Thank you.
That was amazing. Thank you, Bryce. Our third reader, Laura Wetzel, is a first-year student focusing on writing for the stage and screen. Now, Laura wouldn't try and rewrite Hughes's book since her poetry skills run to bad haikus. But she'd ask other poets to add more montages with a broader theme of hate deferred. And we may not know that when Laura was 17, she went to Bali, Indonesia to help make a surf film with Jerry Lopez, Rory Russell, and some surfers from Australia. We won't ask what role she played. Laurel is doing a theatrical piece this evening, so we're going to let her introduce her actors. Laurel Wetzel.
Hi, thank you for coming. Since I am not a minister, would you go on that side? Audrey, would you be here?
Yeah.
So this is first 2 scenes from a full-length play that I'm not done with yet. It's a work in progress. It's called The New Religionists. And I'd like to introduce some talented actors that gave a nice evening to come and read my words. So I'm really grateful. This is Andy Botrell. She's with the Vagrancy Theater Company, and she's playing the minister in both parts. And this is McCall Sinnott. See if I got that right. You did. Good. And then she's playing Audrey, 68 years old, and Audrey, 7 years old. And Robert Seeley, if you came to the last reading, he played last time a Missourian that became stupid, and now he's playing a father and a jailer. So I'll be reading the scene notes. So, Act 1, Scene 1. Time and place, it's 2081. A winter morning in a jail cell. The jail cell bars are made of killer pink beams of light. There's a bouncy bed mound, a washing device, a small table, and a large toilet disguised as a sofa chair. At Rise, wearing a glittering spandex jail suit, Audrey, 68, bounces on the bed mound. A jailer shuts off the killer pink beam, sways Minister 1 inside. Audrey, 68, bounces off the bed and waves.
Hi!
Good morning.
I see they finally thought of calling in a woman type. Those male types all fled before my blasphemous words, sputtering, clutching their precious wangles.
How do you do? I'm Junior Minister 1 from the New Religionists, the sect division known as...
Obeyance and thorning! Just kidding, you must be from flaxen bondage and rope preparation?
Yes!
That's so fun! Are you here to offer me peace, resolution, tides, and flailing? I haven't been whipped in such a long time. Or will I be released from this jail by offering you my best horizontal position?
Oh, that is an honor. No, I'm not allowed to touch you or parts.
Poor suffering one, only a watcher. You must have a favorite position, yes? I prefer the back leg break 6B.
Oh, I'm not familiar with that one.
The position is entered upon like this.
Audrey leaps atop the bed, bounces off and lands in a balletic, legs spread wide open pose.
That is watchable. Many, I am sure, worship at the feet of one such as yours after
After they came to the altar quickly. I'm working on a new tenant for this position alone. Don't look so worried. I know I won't be released to preach against without re-education surgeries. If I am ever released from prison at all, it might take too many surgeries to allow me to function in a useful citizen fashion.
Our sect works to implement changes to the stricture laws to make sure that your most godly edicts are spread.
Hard to keep track of that which edits are godly or ungodly.
It is, and ever since the militant New Religionist cadre was banned.
You mean executed?
Oh, we prefer banned. We do not understand your refusal to stop. We wish to work with you, not against.
So how are the crowds doing? All my follower priests and priestesses out there happily obeying my new mind virus tenets? No priestly programmer able to break my virus code?
No, and the mind virus spreads horribly. Please give us the stop code and peaceful neo-Bible verses discovered in the ashes and kept from our unbeliever eyes.
I didn't burn all the books and computers in 2030. The priestly New Religionists cadre did.
The priestly cadre regrets not keeping back some knowledge for study purposes.
Oh, study purposes. Oh, yes, for the king priest to keep hidden and prevent independent thinking citizens.
The priestly cadre has been reorganized, and our sect has garnered the majority vote. We have banished most of the old. We will be known as the Flaxen Priests on Tuesday.
Oh, I'm sure my followers love and obey the New Religionist tenets as proper worshipping citizens should.
But those are only your tenets in the virus. And the followers no longer listen or believe the priestly cadre, nor will they follow our flaxen tenets.
Then my followers are on the holy path to wisdom. Are they happily slaughtering the unbelievers?
The killings must stop. Over 900,000 yesterday alone. One of your tenets is love one another and do no harm.
I weighted the virus code more heavily with the tenet, kill a foul and noisome serpent. Serpents of evil, that's what this has become. And my God orders a cleansing. Unbelievers must be blessed into a clean death.
Please, you must give us the code.
I should just let you all burn, like you let the books burn. Fat, noisome, greedy blobs of pus. If I poked, I imagine they'd ooze blackish green hate. I imagine it's slimy and coats a mind well. Your hate.
The old cadre is gone. It is a new dawn for a new...
cadre. Out with the old, in with the more poisonous.
Perhaps, if I explain, if I speak to them of your reasons, I ask, pray that you share truthfully with me what led you to this. Through my understanding, may I receive peaceful guidance, and I swear on the ropes of bondage that I will release this knowledge, your history, your true, unfiltered history, through all citizen communication channels.
Wow. Swear. That's a big promise.
I swear. And I may be able to help you. They wanted me to.
Mind light, I'm sure.
Yes.
My entire story may not help.
Might. May I record?
Sure, go ahead.
Minister 1 opens a recording device. The minister signals. Go ahead.
Start when, I wonder? The height of the preaching? When I found the holy bits of paper from the one original Bible that survived the fires? Perhaps earlier. Yes, worship at mother's feet, father's feet. I love my father. And the holy words of our minister. What does a 3-year-old know? Or a 4-year-old? Or 7? I was 7, I think.
Lights fade on Audrey 68. Scene 2. The year is 2020. It is spring, night. The location is a greenhouse. Downstage are 2 poles set 3 feet apart. Between poles is a platform. Wearing combination camera light devices atop their helmets, Audrey's father and the minister lead Audrey 7. Wearing a sparkly dress atop the platform facing the audience, they handcuff her wrists to the poles.
Lots of treats tonight after you've been a good girl. Lighting will be better with these new natural LPD lights.
Then the film will be holy and blessedly profitable.
Amen.
And the new holy painkiller I administered is said to be very effective. Feel this? No? Then all is ready. Remember, God loves you so much and rewards him who love him.
I love God.
All love God.
The father pulls on a white mask painted with a smiley face.
Time for the silly face. And what do you do?
Hold still, think of God, and smile.
Like a good girl.
Would you zoom for a close-up this time, Your Holiness?
It is a blessed event. We shall enter God's kingdom with joy and singing.
The father and minister start their cameras. The father stands behind Audrey 7, nudges her to speak.
Hi, I'm Audrey. I'm 7, and God loves me.
The first holy hymn song, found among the remains of the apocalypse, shall be sung. Blessed be the relics from the past that show us our past and show us the way to a God-filled future.
Whenever I feel afraid, I hold my head erect and whistle a happy tune, so no one will suspect I'm afraid. When shivering in my shoes, I strike a careless pose and whistle a happy tune, and no one ever knows I'm
The
afraid.
father places one hand over Audrey's forehead.
The result of this deception is very strange to tell, for when I fool the people I fear, I fool myself as well.
The father unzips his pants. They drop to the floor. He looms over Audrey.
I whistle a happy tune, and every single time the happiness in the tune convinces me that I'm not afraid. Make believe you're brave, and the trick will take you far, for you may be as brave as you make you believe you are. Do 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 do. You may be as brave as you make believe you are.
The father pulls Audrey 7 against him as the minister zooms in with his camera. The lights go to black. The lights come back up on Audrey 68 and Minister 1.
Well, that's what I remember after the apocalypse and the first loss of data knowledge, but before all the burnings, we did our best to obey our spiritual advisors.
Or risk banishment.
Or risk banishment. Shall I go on?
Lights change. End of scene 2.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you, Laurel, and thank you, cast. Our next reader will be Susanna L. Now, Susanna is in her second year with a fiction concentration. We have some more seats down here, by the way, if anybody, and one or two over here, if anyone would like to sit down. Her take on Hughes's title would be A Montage of a Sense of Humor Deferred. And it would be about her losing her sense of humor with too much fiction writing. Susanna believes an artist should never be afraid to be kind to herself and to love what comes out of hard work, like too much fiction writing, because it is pulling you closer to something real and beautiful. We like that. Everybody, Susanna Luthi.
Thank you, Karen. Thank you, everyone, for coming. This is a short story called Savings. And yes, it's a little dark. Claudia Romero Carter had to attend a funeral at the Church of Latter-day Saints and also collect an outstanding loan from Johnny Ramirez with newly compounded interest. First, she came home in one of her angry turns of mind, and here she saw her daughter's dirty Toyota in her driveway. She braked behind it, getting out of her own undented, good-as-new 10-year-old Volvo, tense and tired, with a cramp in her neck. The roofers had not yet finished the job that morning at her house. She checked her watch for the time, noon, and they were already gone. They had left the half-used pallet of asphalt paper in the side yard near her frozen yucca. The weather was stark and droughty, as if on purpose trying to kill her grass. But the rainy season would start soon, with this November air sharpening, and still the roof wasn't done. So far it had cost her $3,500, maybe more if the laborers took any more time. She let her shoulders roll down and her belly hang. She liked to let her shoulders down sometimes when no one could see. The porch needed sweeping. She thought about repainting the house soon if there was any money left. Her daughter, Denise, with the Toyota, was probably inside, probably eating straight out of the refrigerated pans of tamales Claudia made for the dinner to follow the funeral. It was Susan Stewart who had died this time, cancer complications. Claudia had been up half of last night working on the tamales, shredding gummed-up chicken and rolling masa. She was tired. The people she was always trying to help, she could only do part of it. They needed to do the rest. She did what she could and didn't ask anyone for credit, just that they do what they should. Denise was the first of Claudia's side of the family to go to community college long enough to talk about it, and she was 22 now, finally completing her last units. She said she would transfer to the university nearby. Denise's hair always looked smooth and taken care of, and she groomed herself with a sense of what was right. Claudia could imagine her in a college classroom with high ceilings and good ideas. That would be a start. Claudia's son, Brett, was 17. He probably smoked pot. Her brother's kids had, for their entire lives, given her premonitions of what dark, hopeless places Brett might go. So she went through his bedroom drawers while putting his laundry away. She hadn't found anything yet, but kept looking. He was skinny and his friends liked him, and that worried her. Maybe they were all high. He was good at math, with his grades slipping only now, and Claudia had her eye on that too. What she could do was her best to save who she could. She'd saved her own life, even becoming a Mormon like her ex-husband. She changed herself a little bit when she married him, and after he left, she had stayed where she was, in their house. This is where she would always stay. Denise had left the front door unlatched, and Claudia pushed it open right into her clean, dark living room. When she wasn't at home, she kept the Venetian blinds shut, and just a few bars of sun glowed through the slats and made pretty yellow lines on the couch. The couch was worn in the good quality leather way. From the outside, no one could see into her house, and this is how she needed it to be, private. "Mom," Denise said. "The food is for the funeral," Claudia said before getting to the kitchen. "Who died?" Denise said. In the kitchen, here was Denise, leaning over the counter and peeling the husk from her second tamale and looking fatter. "My friend," Claudia said, "my friend Susan." "Susan who?" said Denise. "My friend from church," Claudia said. Denise started to wrap the tamale into its husk again. "Sorry," she said, "I didn't know." Denise had stopped attending church with Claudia when she was a teenager, burying her head beneath her pillow when Claudia tried to wake her early on Sundays. Denise's father had recently left for good, and Claudia thought maybe that was the problem and talked about God being the father now as she tried pulling Denise out of bed. She used to try all kinds of things, tearing the covers off Denise's body, and Denise grabbing the headboard and never budging, even when Claudia tugged her feet. Claudia had always been strong. Denise was even stronger, playing softball and doing weight training at school. She couldn't be budged. I remember Susan, Denise said. There are 3 Susans at church, Claudia said. I remember a Susan, Denise said again. Sorry, Mama, you and her were friends. Susan had been an organizer of functions and funerals, a chair of committees. Church family, Claudia said. It's church family. When it came to family, Claudia was way ahead of her own. She lived in a clean suburban neighborhood where the lawns had irrigation. Still, she went back to her relatives and their neighbors to offer a lending hand. She'd loaned stashes of money to the people who needed it and who couldn't go to anyone else because they didn't have collateral. They always seemed to have time enough for Coronas on the mosquitoed porches at night and no time for making themselves better. Where Claudia was now in life wasn't good enough yet. Life had complications, unforeseen, that kept her from going far enough. Denise said she would go to the funeral too. I appreciate that, Claudia said, but I need to take care of something first, so we'll have to leave soon. Or do you want to drive separate? I don't mind, Denise said. I can go with you. She opened the refrigerator again and pulled out a pot of soup. Claudia had to explain that she was stopping over on the north side because she had a new family to check on there. She was going to collect from Johnny Ramirez. God, Denise said, I'm not going with you over there. Long ago, when the kids were younger, Claudia had to take them along with her when she went collecting. She usually left them in the car in case there were arguments, and Denise had never liked that, always crying as a child. Always, Claudia thought, crying with a sense of what was right. Denise ate the tomato chicken soup cold from the pot with a long metal spoon. Claudia watched her, getting tense and naughty and even angry about going to the north side and all the hard things she had to do to stop the gap between her past and future so they didn't flow together. Mama, 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 Denise said. She put the soup back into the refrigerator and left a spill of red broth pooling on the counter. Claudia said, Denise. Claudia sat at the kitchen table in one of the plastic chairs. She put her head on the table and shut her eyes, letting her belly hang again and feeling the knots in her back moving around. So many trouble spots, so much trouble. Don't fall asleep yet, Denise said. You look like you're ready to drop dead. You're in the middle of nowhere, Claudia said, until you get to college. I'm fine, Denise said. I gave you a good start, Claudia said. I've been in school forever, Denise said. That doesn't mean anything, Claudia said. You could be better than everyone. In a burst of sadness, she spit on her hand to wipe a dirty spot from her shoe. Cover that awful tattoo when you come to the church, Claudia said. No one will see it, Mama, said Denise. It isn't right, Claudia said. You have to do the right thing to make people comfortable. At their funerals, Denise said. Go, said Claudia. Denise sighed out loud and rolled her eyes. She smacked Claudia's shoulders with her palms, rubbing out some of the knots. This felt good, and Claudia almost let herself moan, releasing all her breath with so much relief. After Denise left, Claudia padded back to her room and got out her ledger sheet from the bottom bureau drawer she kept locked and stored with her client's files. Today she would just get over to Johnny Ramirez's house, the house he was paying for with her money loaned at an interest rate, not as low as it would be from the banks, but the banks wouldn't give him anything. That's why her clients went to her in the first place. She had to keep the money coming in order to help all the people coming to her. And she had to keep living better, keep making herself better. She hated how things always were, staying the same or getting better only slowly. This month Johnny owed her $1,850, and this wasn't bad considering how much grace she'd given him. Like most people, he wasn't smart about what he did with the power to spend. He was still poor, he should remember that. Just because he had cash in hand didn't mean he should buy anything beyond what he needed. But she couldn't do anything to change him. She had more people who wanted help, and she couldn't tie up all her money in one place. Most of her clients knew this. She had made it clear, and her roofing bill was due. Claudia changed some of her clothes. She kept the same skirt and replaced her plain cotton shirt with a sheer rayon organdy blouse. It had a ruffled collar, dark blue, not quite black. She was a lively, fierce person in it. She looked all right for the funeral. The tamales she wrapped and shut up in her car trunk. She drove to the north side of town where the houses weren't worth her loans or a mortgage, all surrounded by sagging apartment buildings and bleached with too much sun and ringed with chain-link fences. She reached the dumpsters at the corner of the little park, big trash heap dumpsters. For the middle of the day, there were many kids in the park playing too close to the garbage. She drove by them slowly, and one of them stared at her, toddling across the tufted grass and then falling, and looking up with a fat face full of regret for its mistake. Maybe this child was too young to go to school, and Claudia felt a real softness in her heart at this thought. She made the left turn, and here she was on the deserted afternoon street of houses that got grimy and crumbly inside and out long before the mortgages would ever be redeemed. She offered to do inspections of these houses before paying out the loans. The home of Johnny Ramirez was in rough shape underneath all the plaster and linoleum. The roof, she gave it maybe a couple more years. While inspecting it for Johnny, she climbed into the attic through the trap door, even hauling the ladder from her house to do it. And the insulation was old, and there had been rodents or something gnawing it. The price for this house had been very low. She told the Ramirezes, Johnny and his mother-in-law and his wife, that even with all the problems, they were right to take it, and she drew up her usual contract in English and checked their income and let them know her interest rate and penalties. Of course, she explained everything in Spanish, but she liked to keep the contract in English. But the house didn't look any better now, after the Ramirezes had been living in it for 6 months, all 3 of them official residents. Johnny and his wife were employed part-time, as she made sure of by showing up at their door at the times they were supposed to be at work. The mother-in-law wasn't working at all, apparently too old to care about where she stayed, just sitting on the old couch and staring hard at Claudia when she stopped by. In the yard there were bright plastic toys from a child that didn't live at the house, and clumps of overgrown ivy around the foundation. It was the Ramirez's house. Claudia didn't think of it as hers. She slowed and parked on the opposite side of the street, perspiring now that the sun had heated up her car. Sweat weighed down her brassiere and stuck her shirt to her back. The afternoon air had turned since it was November, but she was as hot as if it were still August, and the heat made her feel bleak and dull. The oaks at the end of the street were as still and ugly as the houses. She walked steady through the Ramirez's broken metal gate and followed the thin cinder-block pathway to the door, which was painted to look like wood. The curtains were drawn in the windows. She had a feeling about that. The Ramirez's were probably hiding from her. Last month she had confirmed this payday with them and had followed up yesterday, and the mother-in-law had answered the phone and been short with her. Even with the curtains drawn, Claudia was going to stay at the door until she and the tamales would be too late for the funeral. Claudia knocked and waited, seeing the reflection of her face in the blank shine of the mauve curtain window. Her face had pouches she didn't like. Her own eyes showed her how she looked fatter than ever before. Her eyes were black, and she could admire their liveliness as if she were someone else. The street was quiet behind her, and there wasn't any noise in the house. She knocked again. She heard feet thudding and muffled on carpet. She could hear this because of how quiet it was all around her, and because the walls of this house were so thin. She knocked again and heard young voices murmuring, Johnny and his wife. She knocked again, and Johnny's wife opened the door, looking angry. Johnny wasn't there. The wife and Claudia stared at each other, and Claudia knew she was as angry as she was. This made her calmer than she had been all day, seeing some fight in someone else. Claudia explained that she was here for the money and smoothed her straight skirt down around her hips and folded her arms across her organdy ruffled bust. The wife, Tina, was small and thin except for her chest. Her breasts were big, and this made her look fatter than she was. Then you looked at her hips and arms, and you realized she was a small person. She told Claudia in Spanish that they would have the money on Monday. She shut the door in haste, and her eyes were mocking with some secret. Claudia had a feeling about that too, and grabbed the handle of the door before Tina could turn the lock in it. She pushed the door into Tina, who fell back, probably surprised at how strong Claudia was. The living room was neat and almost empty except for a dirty couch draped in a blanket, a blinking, muted television, and the mother-in-law who sat on the couch. Claudia kept her eyes safe on Tina, who had her fists bunched on her hips. Claudia said she wanted to be fair, and if she came on Monday, the amount Johnny owed her would be much more than what he had to pay today. She explained that Johnny had not paid for the last month, and that this made him waste money they should be able to use for whatever they wanted. Tina said nothing. Claudia clutched her keys tight in her hand and said she would help them through this. When she looked into Tina's eyes, she didn't know what to think. She saw Johnny coming down the hallway, relaxed and with both hands in his pockets. You know how it is, Claudia said to him, talking past Tina. We all help each other out. Johnny smiled. Claudia said she thought he should give her the money now. How much? Johnny said. She stepped close to him and told him $1,900. His eyes were black and went blank. She went on with what she had to say. It was the same sort of conversation she'd had so many times, and she let her mind go dull and dark and let their faces go fuzzy. They could be anyone. Let them pay her now, she said in a loud voice, and with every payment the debt would go down. She felt Johnny draw back, and when she refocused her vision, she saw him raising his arm, knowing he would hit her, and then he did, and it was still a surprise. She felt she was moving very slowly and kneed him in the crotch as he slapped her neck harder than she had ever hit her own daughter. She grabbed his face, holding his cheeks in her fingernails, and he punched her again in the throat. It seemed as if everything in this bad house were falling on top of her. She heard thin voices prying through a cottony sound in her ear, while he pinned her wrists to her side, pressing them into her fat until her tears came. Johnny stronger than Denise ever had been. Claudia clamped her mouth shut as he blew his breath across her face. He twisted her away from him, and with her head limp and hanging down, she saw the cinder block on the floor by the front door, more ugly debris of this house, the kind of debris that could fill up your life. She shut her eyes. Denise was probably at the funeral, at the church. When Claudia opened her eyes, Tina was picking up the cinder block. Claudia watched safe from Johnny's arms as it came softly and painfully down on her head, not like she would have ever thought a brick would fall. Johnny pushed her underneath him, crushing her with his whole body, and staring at her with dark eyes that made her understand him, and she felt a deep, sad love for herself as the brick crushed her down.
Yeah. Now we know what Susanna's thinking about when we've seen her concentrate. Our final student reader of the evening will be Matt Ackles, who's in his second year in the MPW program with a fiction concentration. And about Hughes' book, Matt says he wouldn't rewrite it because Langston Hughes was a beast. Or that's what I heard him say. And he's afraid he might just mess it up. He says artists shouldn't be afraid to eat donuts because he does a lot of serious thinking in the donut shop. And we may not know about Matt that he got stung by a stingray once. And yes, it hurts like, well, it doesn't exactly feel like eating donuts. Ladies and gentlemen, Matt Ackles.
Thank you so much, everyone, for being here, and Caron for putting everything together. I think this is, whatever, I'll yell. I am a fiction student, but I'm going to read a piece of not fiction, a memoir, because I knew I was going after Susanna, and I didn't want to have to follow her. So this is a piece of memoir. It's got footnotes, and this is going to be weird. If you get bored, just fall asleep. Richard's next, and it'll be great. But it's got two parts. One is a bedtime story my father used to tell us when we were kids. When I'm being my father, I'll be over here. The other part of the footnotes, and it's my voice now, and when I'm doing me, I'll be over here, and I'll try to fix the voice too, okay? So send text now or whatever, because you don't have to pay attention if it's boring. Okay, this is titled Our Father's Story. Once upon a time, there were 3 siblings. He always started the same way. We'd be causing a ruckus in our 30-square-foot bedroom, 3 boys under the age of 12. Sam, 11, me, 7, Chris, 5. Just after lights out, we'd turn socks and pillows into slingshots and shields. He'd come down the dark hallway, past our other sibling's room, Emma, who was 9, and Thomas, the baby, always sniffling his nose. In those days, he seemed to have a perennial cold. And when we heard him, we'd call an immediate truce, dive under flannel comforters, and pretend to sleep. I remember only half closing my eyes, peeking to see him silhouetted against the lamp in the den. Wispy hairs on his balding head, his big Middle Eastern nose, a growing stomach under his button-up pajamas. Dad was old-fashioned like that, wearing button-up pajamas. Their names were David, Susan, and James. The same dumb names every time. And he'd always pause before James, letting us all say, "Yeah, Dad, it's James, hurry up." Or we'd try to guess other versions of names for comedic effect. Cletus or Winifred or something like that. I think he wanted to name us David, Susan, and James, but Mom produced Samuel, Emma, and Matthew instead. I always felt a little bad about that. Now, they lived with their mother in a small house near the park. Not to keep interrupting my father's gripping story, but just so you know, we too lived in a small house near a park, 3871 Princess Lane, Dallas, Texas to be exact, right down the street from Peter Pan Park. Ideal fairy tale land. But we had a dad, and for some reason, David, Susan, and James never did. One evening after school, they decided to take a walk and play catch in the park with a baseball. Their mother told them to be back for dinner before sunset, before they got home. They said, okay, and ran down to the park as fast as they could. After playing catch for a few minutes, David threw the ball over James's head, and it rolled into the woods. Because it was commonly assumed that I was James, Sam would interrupt and ask, wait, did David overthrow the ball, or did James just not catch a perfectly good throw? This would have me gripping the end of my tube sock, ready for another slingshot attack, but Dad would simply respond, shh, and keep going. Now, they knew their mother told them never to go into the woods, for any reason, but this was their only baseball, and they really wanted it back. David said, James, why don't you run in and get the ball and we'll keep playing? James said, I don't know, maybe you should since you're older and stronger. It tickled my dad's dry sense of humor to make these kids very sweet, passive-aggressive versions of his demonic sons. David said, okay, let's both go in together and we'll be right out. They started to move toward the woods, but just before they moved past the first tree, they heard a noise behind them. It was Susan. Guys, I don't think we should go in. Mom said never to go into the woods. Emma is angelic, the most perfect, amazing sister any of us could have ever asked for. And so we terrorized her life. Oh, please, don't be such a baby, Susan, said David. You can't stay. You can stay here if you're too afraid, said James. But Susan didn't want to feel left out. So all three of them walked into the woods. It was dark, and the moment they stepped inside, it felt like the sun went down immediately. The trees cast shadows shaped like animals and other creatures. It felt a bit colder in the woods, like the seasons had shifted back a few months. All of the plants were a dark gray-green, and the trunks of the trees were twisted and black. An owl hooted somewhere deep in the brush. David took a few steps into the trees, looking near his feet for the ball. James went over to peek under a large bush, and Susan kicked some dead leaves with her tennis shoes. The ball, it seemed, had vanished. James said, maybe we should just go home and ask Mom for a new ball tomorrow. I was an aggressive materialist as a boy. My dad wore a suit to work and put a $1 bill in all 5 of our lunches every morning, which had me convinced that he was rich. I begged and begged him for a whittling knife one year for my birthday, and I didn't get it, but continued to beg so aggressively that it appeared as a belated gift a week later. The first thing I decided to carve, of course, was a second knife out of wood. Within 2 days, I had sliced my hand open and almost lost my finger. They knew my dad's name in the emergency room, a perk of having 4 boys. David agreed, but when they turned around to leave, they couldn't find their way out of the woods. They had only taken a few steps since the beginning of the trees, but the park was nowhere in sight. They looked around and were suddenly in a massive forest. Susan said, guys, how do we get out of here? Just walk this way, David said. But as they walked, the forest got denser and darker and colder. The hooting owl grew louder. Susan said, guys, I don't think this is helping. And then James said, let's spread out and look for an exit. My father has 9 siblings, and to this day, all but one of them live within a 2-mile radius of the house they grew up in. Spreading out was not an option. No, said Susan, we should stick together. Susan, you're such a baby. But if you're afraid, I will stay with you, said David. The 3 of them searched for a way out of the forest for what seemed like several hours. The woods appeared so small and safe on the outside, like it would be so easy to navigate. But as time wore on, it expanded and grew more confusing and complex and dark, so that eventually they felt completely confused and out of options. One night, long after these bedtime stories ceased, after Sam and I moved out of that room into another on the opposite end of the house, a room far away from Mom and Dad where we could listen to Pearl Jam and let puberty slam into us like a freight train, I got into a fight with my father. We stood on either side of a small oak island in the kitchen, lit by a large bulb out on the front porch and a green analog clock over the oven, 2:20 a.m. I remember getting worked up, not being able to sleep, and making a sandwich. We rarely fought, Dad and I, but when I was around 14 and Sam flew away to college in Washington, I used to stay up late and let emotions have their way with me. On this night, I stood with 2 hands on the island, eyes wet, an open jar of Peter Pan peanut butter in front of me. After a long silence, my dad said through phlegm in his throat, "Please tell me how to help you, son." The three siblings felt hopeless. My dad would trail off whenever possible, hoping that we fell asleep. Sometimes we dozed off slightly to the sound of his heavy voice and a thorn bush scraping against the window. But whenever he would stand up, the person whose bed he sat on that night would wake up and catch him before he left the room. "Please finish," Chris would say. "It's working," Sam would say. But it wasn't. Even though we'd heard it 100 times, we all fought to stay awake and find the end of our father's story. The three siblings felt hopeless and afraid. But just then, Susan saw a faded path leading through the trees. This is bullshit. Emma has no sense of direction. They decided to follow it, although they did not know where they were going. They couldn't tell if the path was getting them closer to home or moving them away. David said, "I wonder if Mom will be mad." James said, "I wonder if Mom will keep dinner warm." They decided to stay on the path because it felt safer than getting off. Dad taught me how to drive a car late at night in a Lowe's parking lot. I maneuvered his white Lincoln Town car between streetlights and shopping baskets. After 5 lessons, he let me pull out onto the road, provided that I stay in the right lane and didn't veer or turn. At the first stoplight, an SUV full of older teenagers pulled up alongside us, and a thin girl with a nose ring rolled down the window, stood up on her seat, and lifted her tank top above her head. She wasn't wearing a bra. My dad looked forward and said in an even voice, "Just keep going straight." Finally, the path led to a larger field in the middle of the forest where they could see the sky. They noticed night was coming soon. Across the clearing, they saw a small wooden cottage. It had a straw roof and a low porch with an empty rocking chair that swayed back and forth. Light glowed from the front window. "Let's go ask the people at the house for help," said Susan. "Or we could just keep looking. How about that?" said James. "I agree with Susan," said David. So they walked across the field, and the house got bigger and bigger as the night got darker and darker. David went onto the porch first. There was a smell like pot roast and warm bread coming from the window. They looked inside and saw a black kettle over the fire and an unfinished game of chess on the table. My whole life, there has been an unfinished chess game in my dad's office. Before I was born, he tells me, he had a client put on death row in Texas. Throughout the appeal process, he would play chess with this man via the mail, sending moves back and forth. 4 years ago, the man was exonerated based on new DNA evidence, a front-page story on the Dallas Morning News. But even though he's out, they still play chess via mail to this day. I tried the same game with a friend during college, but we gave up after a week and said we'd play online instead. We never did. In front of the door, there was a welcome mat that read, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. "Let's go inside," said David. "It smells good," said James. They cracked open the door, and it made a whining sound. Inside, they began to look for a map or some hint of how to escape the forest. Susan said, "Hello, is anyone home?" James ran over to the boiling pot in the fireplace, but noticed just before he drank the stew that there was a large picture framed up above the mantel. "What's a mantel?" little Chris would ask. "It's the place where we hang our stockings," Sam would say. "Oh, is that where Mickey Mantle comes from?" "Guys," James said, "look at this." The painting seemed 100 years old, framed in fading gold, covered with spider webs and dust. David reached up to brush away the filth. After cleaning it, they could see the picture. It was of the siblings, David, Susan, and James. They were on a narrow path in a huge forest much like this one. They all faced a different direction, looking for something, and under a large tree just out of their sight was a baseball. "Whose house is this?" said David. And just then there came a strong wind, and the fire died down, and everything grew dark. The air started to smell cold, and that owl landed on the railing outside on the porch, hooting and looking at them. "I think I figured it out," said Susan. "This is a magical forest. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. If we walk forward, we'll always get further and further from home. But if we walk backwards, we'll find the edge of the woods." David said, "Yes, that makes complete sense." Dad was never great about wrapping up the action. In all of my memories, there's legitimately only one other bedtime story he ever told, and he told it one time. It was the Shaggy Dog story. Again, his dry sense of humor was lost on our young minds. In this tale, a man went on search to find the world's shaggiest dog. Every night, this lasted for several weeks, the man would find a shaggy dog and then learn it wasn't the shaggiest. Finally, he found a really shaggy dog, called it the winner, and went home. A most disappointing ending, which prepared me well for a TV show called Lost I rather liked in college. But when I look back now, I see a storyteller who had to be in court at 7 in the morning. A storyteller who would pore over papers until dinner and would come home to 5 kids climbing all over his suit. He was tired and just needed a way to end the story. But he felt guilty, so he strung out the suspense with no payoff. These late nights in a hot bedroom telling a stupid fairy tale were the only moments he had to spend with his boys. The father wasn't absent in the kid's story. He was the narrator. So the 3 siblings started to leave the house walking backwards, and suddenly they were moving down the path through the woods, everything getting lighter and lighter. They passed a big tree just like the one in the picture, and James remembered where the ball was hiding. Hell yeah, James! Hopped off the path, circled the tree, walking backwards the whole time, and sure enough, there was the ball, nudged under a root. He called out, "Found it!" "Great," said David. "Perfect, let's go," said Susan. They backed up a bit more and found themselves in the park, the sun almost below the trees and the sky red. Now that they were out of the woods, David turned and tried to walk home forward, and it seemed to work. He ran ahead, up the street all the way. Susan followed. James came last, gripping the ball. The 3 arrived home to wash their hands, just as their mother finished setting the table. But I don't truly remember the ending. By now, all 3 of us had probably passed out, so Dad trailed off and left the room quietly, walking 10 steps down the hall and crawling into his side of my parents' large bed. He probably double-checked his alarm clock and rubbed his forehead. Looking back now, I wonder, as he fell asleep, if he knew the ending was a lie. I wonder if he knew that David would move to Washington and Susan to St. Louis and James to Los Angeles, that they would spread out to look for something, but every step would bring them further from home. I wonder still if he knows why that forest was so dark, and whose cottage that was, and what would have happened to those kids if they didn't come home for dinner.
Thank you very much, Matt. That was fun. Now, before we bring our faculty reader for the evening, we want to take a moment to thank our faculty who've turned up. So please raise your hands or stand up. Let people know you're here. Thank you, thank you, thank you. Okay, our faculty reader for the evening is Richard Rayner. Richard is an English writer who's lived in Los Angeles for more than 20 years. He is the author of 5 novels, including Murder Book, The Cloud Sketcher, and Los Angeles Without a Map, which became a film starring David Tennant, Julie Delpy, and Johnny Depp. His nonfiction books include a memoir, The Blue Suit, Drake's Fortune, The Associates, and A Bright and Guilty Place, the history of certain scandalous Los Angeles crimes of the 1920s and 1930s. His short stories have appeared in The New Yorker, Esquire, Black Clock, Granta, and just about everywhere. And his nonfiction journalism has been featured in The New Yorker, The New York Times, The Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, GQ, and many other publications. His work has been translated into more than 20 languages, and he writes extensively for film and television. He is the proud father of 2 sons, the eldest of whom is a student at USC. Right on. He lives with his wife and family in Venice, California. Richard says that his tweak on Mr. Hughes' title would be Montage of a Jump Over a Cliff, Hopefully Deferred. He thinks an artist should be unafraid to go on. If you refuse to quit, nobody can stop you. His life shrinks or expands in proportion to the happiness of his children. On the one hand, as Cyril Connolly said, they are the enemies of promise. On the other hand, as Ray Carver noted, They are the fires of unexpected inspiration. And something we may not know, but I've heard rumors, he dances. Not only with his wife, but with his cats. Ladies and gentlemen, Richard Rayner.
Thanks, Caron. Really sounded like you were talking about someone else. Thanks everybody for coming out. And thanks for the previous readers. It's just the standard of the students in this program is just utterly awesome and inspiring. It's incredible. I like linked short story cycles. I've got a couple of such cycles on the go, some of which have been published in some of the places Caron mentioned, some of which haven't. I've got one cycle that's a kind of a contemporary Pat Hobby thing. The Pat Hobby, Scott Fitzgerald, hack writer, failing in Hollywood, that feels like a story very familiar. And I've got another short story cycle which is sort of based on my, I'm very interested in Los Angeles history, and I've kind of made a beat out of that to some extent. And LA has a kind of big history with the occult. And so I've got a cycle of stories going, which is essentially about what would have happened if some Brentwood crocodile had actually unlocked the secret of the Kabbalah and had become the kind of den mother to a coven of West Side witches, which is the overarching title of this cycle. And the one I'm going to read is a work in progress, so it's kind of not quite there, but it's sort of getting there, I hope. It's called Cougar Witch Plot. Megan Maloney was done with therapy, done with meditation and jogging, done with all of the conventional palliatives. And though her rage went on pouring itself into fantasies of wild justice, she opted not to buy the cute little nickel-plated Smith & Wesson that she'd seen online and so discounted at sharpsuiter.org, but instead fixed lunch with Alice Raskin, usually known simply as Mrs. Raskin, who, Megan had heard, was some kind of witch or cabalist or sorceress and could take care of the situation with spells, chants, and whatever. I want him to die like horribly, said Megan, surveying her surroundings in the Earth Cafe on Main Street in Santa Monica, where it was the usual hubbub of successful women of a certain age, lunching and chatting in pairs, and other women dressed casually in sweats and looking relaxed and fit, recently returned from Gold's Gym or Yoga Works. So what if Mrs. Raskin was a fraud? Megan felt better already. I want him to contract like testicular cancer and suffer just bucket loads before a bus slams into him and crushes him. He slept with you, but he hated you, said Mrs. Raskin, who had clearly once been a beauty and in many ways still was. Tall, slim, dressed with oddball elegance in a white lace blouse and a vest of antique velvet. Her smooth, pale skin was untouched by plastic surgery or Botox and seemed preserved by some other means. She was maybe over 50, maybe over 60, but her exact age was impossible to determine. Mrs. Raskin's spooky eyes suggested black infinities of experience. He mocked you, Mrs. Raskin said, peering straight into Megan's thoughts. He humiliated you. How could I possibly have fallen for him, said Megan, gulping her second glass of Cabernet. Usually she said no to booze at lunch, but today she was making an exception. Oh, grow up, Megan. The truth was, of course, that Megan knew exactly why she'd fallen for Fred Gilbert, who had been tall, broad, muscular, with features that belonged on Mount Rushmore in a comic book. And all those factors had merely been the beginning of Megan's interest. For Fred Gilbert had properties scattered all over Europe, plus the house by Neutra in the Palisades. He was uber handsome, and Megan should have known all along that if something seems too good to be true, it is too good to be true. Just a week ago, almost a year into their relationship, she discovered that, along with all his other toys and treasures, Fred Gilbert had a wife and 3 children that he'd admitted to mention. I'm 34, said Megan. Okay, as if. I'm 38, and he handed me a pretend reality, and I so bought it. Like an idiot, Megan had viewed Fred Gilbert as a keeper. She only had herself to blame, and that was the cruelest cut of all. So what if I'm 40, Megan said with a sniffle. He lied to me and then he dumped me like trash. I feel beaten and stupid. Mrs. Raskin handed her a napkin. I'm so not on the shelf. You're whatever age you want to be, said Mrs. Raskin. You're a strong woman. You're famous. Not anymore, not really, said Megan, coyly brushing her hair away from her face, a gesture she played for the camera 100 times. Megan had straight, long hair, ash blonde, and good hands, not feminine hands especially, but with slender, elegant fingers. Her large blue eyes were swift to convey surprise, sorrow, amusement. Eyes, hair, hands, humour. These had been her selling features back in the day. But it was over 3 years since she'd been able to land a part. A new generation of casting directors no longer knew her name. Her agent dropped her calls. People thought she'd died or vanished, or worse, gone to live in New Zealand. I've pretty much put my acting career on hold. I sell cosmetics and I'm damn good at it. Of course you are, said Mrs. Raskin, and don't shortchange yourself. Everybody remembers red-hot lawyer Texas woman. They do, said Megan, knowing that she was being played but grooving with it. It was a classic. The shut doors that were Mrs. Raskin's eyes opened a crack, allowing Megan to glimpse, or was she just imagining that she glimpsed, sparks and glowing red fires. It's criminal that you're not in multiple new shows. I find it inconceivable. You're right, said Megan, roused. But then she saw that a fly had strayed into the dregs of her wine and was spinning there, gorged on sugar, dying no doubt, or dead already, and she felt her heart grow heavy again. You know what Fred Gilbert said the last time I went up for a part? He undermined you. He pulled the rug from under the feet of a strong woman who scares him. He said, is the show called Desperate Grandmothers? He deserves to be punished. He so does, said Megan with a brief gale of laughter. Raising her hand, she signalled to the handsome waiter who looked a lot like Brad Pitt, the young Brad Pitt, the preposterously gorgeous Brad from Thelma and Louise, who was actually from Italy or had cultivated an Italian accent with the pride of some post-millennial Stanislavski. I'll take another glass, if you please. It's the Cabernet. At your service, signorina, said the waiter, leaning across Megan and brushing her shoulder with the bare, tan skin of his forearm. Before, with a flourish, he whisked away the glass that had the dead fly in it and made it his ostentatious business to hasten back at once with another glass, fresh and full. Well, la-di-da, said Mrs. Raskin. That boy likes you. You should fuck his brains out. Megan spluttered into her wine. He's in awe of you, said Mrs. Raskin. I'm way older than his mother, most likely. Forget that nonsense and self-pity. He sees a beautiful woman who can teach him about the world. The world seems to get further away from me on a daily basis, Megan said. With a stab of pain, she remembered Fred Gilbert in that room at the Fairmont Hotel, knotting an Armani tie in front of the mirror and saying, it's over, get a life.
Yeah.
Fred knew about the world all right. He did snazzy things with money. His knack for moving cash and making it grow had only been spurred by the catastrophe of 2008. He was a superman of the objective world. It's a book I used to have that disappeared, The World, said Megan. It's floating into the distance and leaving me stranded. Take action. Assert your reality and mean it, said Mrs. Raskin, reaching into her fringed Jimmy Choo tote for a fountain pen and a moleskin notebook plastered with day-glow stickers and girly swirls. The fountain pen was green, Megan observed, and more exotic in appearance than even Mrs. Raskin herself, with a snake-shaped clip of sinuous, curving gold. Mrs. Raskin unscrewed the top and wrote with swift, decisive strokes. What are you reading in your book group? Jane Austen is generally Jane Austen, admitted Megan. Why did she feel defensive? She unashamedly worshipped Jane Austen and went gaga for those heroines who laughed at the precariousness of their fates and negotiated worlds of rank and money with smarts. With smarts and sex. Or the promise of sex. Whatever. Jane may save you, said Mrs. Raskin. Her dark eyes gleamed. But sometimes you need help from the beyond. Fairies, spirits, demons. Mrs. Raskin ripped out the page on which she'd been writing. I'll need a possession of Mr. Gilbert, she said. An item of clothing would be ideal. If unwashed, so much the better. Megan inspected the creamy unlined paper into which the cruel nib of Mrs. Raskin's fancy fountain pen had almost carved a 90049 address. The ink was red with a whiff of vinegar. Demons. It had to be a joke, right? Mrs. Raskin was just a nubby old broad. Something with his blood on it, said Megan, to make the spell work better. Your faith isn't necessary, said Mrs. Raskin, with that same ominous ability to look straight into Megan's mind. But don't forget to bring a checky. 2 days later, Megan was back at the Earth, this time with Kate Zola and Lily Prendergast, her best friends and most loyal compadres. They sat by the window, as usual, in the shade but with a view of the street and the human traffic. 3 identical copies of Pride and Prejudice, yet another new edition, this one handsomely bound in gold cloth, lay on the table in front of them. But for once they weren't talking about Darcy or Wickham or Mr. Collins, or Elizabeth Bennet's self-preserving tactics of wit and irony. How much? Said Lily, not bothering to feign astonishment. 5,000, said Megan. She wanted 5 grand, said Kate with one of her raucous laughs, and you gave it to her. This is too sweet. Megan answered with a defiant shrug. She had an audience and a story to tell. She was enjoying herself. You don't have that kind of money right now, said Lily, and Lily knew, being a CPA and in charge of Megan's taxes. Lily was fair-haired, pink-faced, and remorselessly competent, while Kate was sharp-featured and hard-boiled, a former lawyer who blogged for the Huffington Post. Lily, a Catholic, was reserved. Kate had once pranced about in spike heels and leather miniskirts to get herself fired from Brackett, Liebler, Kaufman, Wimbash, McTootney, and Tom. I put it on a card. The visa I didn't max out yet, said Megan. She's like letting me pay in installments. No, said Lily, who paid all her bills on time and monitored her credit rating on a daily basis. Lily's husband had died in a car wreck a year ago, and she was bringing up 2 sons solo. Kate, already into her 3rd marriage, had twin daughters and didn't mind if she got dirt under her fingernails. Kate's hair was a tangle of unruly curls. Lily knew what carelessness could sometimes do to the best of your hopes and plans. Where does the old crocodile live, said Kate. She wanted to know. Where does she live? Don't tell me, in Beverly Hills, right? Brentwood, admitted Megan. She has this totally swag 3-story craftsman with a tennis court and a pool. Megan, seemingly fated never to have children of her own, spoke and dressed like the teenagers her friends were trying to raise. Ditziness was Megan's incognito, her stratagem against the mire and fury. And she's got the same gardener as the guy who creates The Mentalist. That figures, said Kate, scoring $5 a pop from suckers like you. And she's not a crocodile, said Megan. She's kind of beautiful in a scary way, like Annie Hall, grown up and gone totally nuts. She said to Kate, you're absolutely not allowed to write about this. Kate held up her hand. Double and triple swear, but I'll die if I don't get the scoop, every single little grisly detail. A woman posing as a witch in Brentwood, said Lily, shaking her head, still trying to get her head around this affront to her orderly worldview. I guess I shouldn't be surprised. This is the city where it would happen. A cabalist, not a witch, said Megan. There's a difference, said Lily, surprised. Her arrangement's not like with Satan. She uses signs and symbols, hidden meanings inside the Bible. The Torah, said Kate. Whatever, said Megan. Anyway, it was this big old black book about the size of a suitcase, and she goes, this is one of the rarest books in the world. It was printed in Italy in the time of the Medicis. And I go, cool. She goes, my mother got it from her grandfather in Budapest. And I go, no, really? And she goes, my mother had the power. In World War II, she made Hitler invade Russia. not Syria. I'm thinking this lady is seriously out of control, but I just go like, wow. And she goes, these secrets come all the way from Moses. He learned them from an angel in the wilderness. And I go, I so totally didn't know that. And she looks through me with those weird eyes she has, and she goes, you'll see soon enough. Then, Megan said, the lights dimmed, and she summoned her followers, and the ceremony began. Her followers, said Kate. Her helpers, flunkies, whatever. There were 3 of them, all young guys. One of them was that kid with the mohawk who works behind the cheese counter at Venice Whole Foods. I know him, Lily said, with a frown crossing the usual frank certainty of her face. Even I think he's adorable. Is she fucking him? That was Kate again, cutting to the chase. Megan said, my guess is that she's doing all 3. Lily's jaw dropped. Kate exhaled audibly. No way. They look like used, just exhausted and wrung out. A brief silence fell. I know, go figure, said Megan. Mrs. Raskin has promised to get them a record deal. It's so bogus, Kate said. She gives a good show, said Megan, recalling how, after she'd handed over a silk tie that Fred Gilbert had left behind at her place, Mrs. Raskin had put the tie on a cleared area of the floor and drawn a circle around it in chalk. Megan said, then she hands each of us, that's me and the 3 boys, our own stick of chalk, and we get down on our knees while she stands there with this plan kind of a deal in her hand, telling us what to draw, lines and shapes, towels with writing inside them and hands growing out of them. Cool Kabbalah shit. Oh, just get over it, said Kate, actually angry now. She's a total imposter. Whatever, said Megan. Anyway, she tells us to hold hands and the lights go out, like completely. Out of nowhere, a wind starts to blow, a Santa Ana or something, except it's shrill howling. And Mrs. Raskin has her hands pressed together, and she's chanting in some language I never heard. She was in a trance, said Lily. Faking it. What a bunch of baloney, said Kate. Megan went on. The room seemed to shiver. The wind dropped, and Mrs. Raskin opened her eyes and held up her hands, and slowly she pulled them apart, and there was something spinning between them, a crystal ball. Megan wasn't laughing anymore, as if the intensity of just the memory was opening the door on some other unknown world. Then she clapped, and the lights came back on. The little spinning ball wasn't there anymore, and Fred's tie was actually gone from inside the chalk circle. One of the young guys took it, Kate said. Maybe, said Megan, but she didn't believe that. She'd been there watching every second. Anyway, Mrs. Raskin goes, it is done. And her voice just creeps me out. It's so weird and strange, like it just came back from wherever it had been, wherever that was. So Fred Gilbert's dead already. Well, duh, like no. See, what did I tell you? It's a total scam. Let's expose this bitch. Mrs. Raskin gave me this. From her bag, Megan took a small box that she placed on the marble tabletop beside the Jane Austens. She said the spell was made, but the choice was mine. She said, open this, and he dies. In silence, the 3 women peered at the box, a small box, brass-hinged, ornately carved, casket-shaped, with mother-of-pearl inlay. Kind of fancy for a box, said Lily. It belonged to an Englishwoman from the burning times. That's what Mrs. Raskin called it. The woman died at the stake, but the box survived. What a bunch of crapola, said Kate. This is straight from frigging pottery barn. Kate reached for the box, but Lily stopped her hand. I don't think we should mess with this. Come on, you can't be serious, said Kate, looking from Lily to Megan, who shrugged and threw a glance towards the cool young waiter who looked like Brad Pitt. That morning, Megan had put on her favourite pair of faded True Religions and tucked in a little pair of old tight boots she knew flattered her legs. She felt relaxed and good about herself with her friends again. Kate's got to be right? Said Megan. I mean, this is a game. I was like losing it, and you guys were out of town, and I hated Fred, and I still do, and I just wasted a shitload of money. but it was way more fun than therapy. Without further ado, Megan seized the box. A faint whiff of vinegar assailed her nostrils as soon as she lifted the lid. Inside lay a strip of black paper, coiled like a spring or snake. The paper stirred. It writhed, as if at the command of a burning hot breeze. It glowed, and Megan saw markings, symbols and letters and hieroglyphs, moving along the strip. "Holy shit," said Megan in a whisper, reaching for the paper, but as she reached, it slithered and rustled, then rose slowly, unfurling like a banner, evading Megan's snatching fingers as it flew up in the air and out the window. "I mean, I don't even know why I was there," said Megan, late in the afternoon of the following day, sitting on a plump, shaggy sheep sofa in the low-ceilinged living room of Mrs. Raskin's Brentwood casement. Megan was already drunk, having swallowed most of an apple martini. It was totally strange, like I don't remember driving there. It was like I was drawn there, compelled or something. Mrs. Raskin's dark, shut-down eyes seemed fathomless. "That was a part of the spell, too," said Megan, guessing the answer even before seeing the hint of a smile that cut across Mrs. Raskin's face. "I stood there, defying him to notice me," Megan went on. She remembered. She'd been at the northeast corner of 4th and Wilshire, across the street from P.F. Chang's, and she'd seen Fred Gilbert come out of the restaurant, talking into his cell and striding with his customary money-whiz confidence. It had been in the middle of the afternoon, just a few hours ago. She said, "But at first he didn't notice me. It was like he couldn't." This had been because Fred was too busy trying to disentangle himself from the thin black snake of black and red paper that gusted from the sidewalk and wrapped itself around his neck. His fingers flapped and flailed, clutching at the paper, which as it was torn burst into flaming pieces, embers that the wind tossed and swirled away. He doubled up, yelling and clutching his pants. "A testicular problem," said Mrs. Raskin. "The pain you wanted, the pain you ordered." He was in pain. "Violent pain," agreed Mrs. Raskin. "I mean, like, that must have really hurt." "But of course," said Mrs. Raskin. Megan's hand shook a little as she helped herself to more martini from the bedewed, solid silver shaker. "And then he did see me," Megan said, recalling how the rugged quarterbackiness of Fred's face had been distorted by agony and fret, and the dawning of an astonished puzzlement that she couldn't help but find funny. "I'm totally ashamed of myself, totally. I laughed. He was the one who was looking stupid and terrified, standing there clutching his balls in the middle of Wilshire Boulevard." Megan gulped at the martini. "I don't think he even saw the bus, but he was sure staring at something." "The demon I sent," said Mrs. Raskin, moving in front of a floor-to-floor ceiling bookcase in which some of her ancient volumes were arrayed. A gown of black silk floated down to the platform mules that adorned Mrs. Raskin's feet. "A fire demon. I feel like so awful about him," Megan said. The Santa Monica big blue bus had smashed into Fred Gilbert from behind, tossing his mutilated body into the air. "Do you," said Mrs. Raskin, "do you feel awful about him? He never stood a chance. He got what he deserved." Megan asked the question that had been nagging at her. "Did we make that happen? Really?" "What do you think?" said Mrs. Raskin. A tingle rushed upwards from the base of Megan's spine. Was that fear or just the booze? Outside, night came down. Through the patio doors, Megan glimpsed the dying light sparkle on the rippling waters of Mrs. Raskin's pool. Swathes of manicured green rolled across the tennis court. And only now did Megan see something else, enshadowed and defined by the sun's setting rays, were 3 smaller areas, side by side, oblongs where the grass grew long and lush like uncut hair. They could almost be graves, Megan thought. "I've been married 3 times and I loved them all," said Mrs. Raskin, dark fires burning in the depths of her eyes. and Megan heard, or dreamed or imagined she heard, distant moans and screams, as if 3 souls, or maybe many more souls, were held captive within Mrs. Raskin's skull, trapped and buzzing like flies. Whoa, said Megan to herself, I've totally gone over to the dark side. It was true what she'd said just a minute ago. She did feel awful about Fred. Well, maybe not that awful. Megan took a deep breath. It really seemed that with Mrs. Raskin's awesome powers, the whole slippery, cruel world of Los Angeles could be brought to heel. And why not? She better tell Kate and Lily that they'd be ditching Jane Austen and switching to Rosemary's Baby or The Shining. Or had Jane written anything with witches? Cablists, whatever. There was a part she'd heard about, something big in a new thing at Showtime. Catherine of Medici slaughtering those pesky Huguenots. Was she totally evil? She wanted and needed that part. Oh, my dear, said Mrs. Raskin with a flash of those troubling eyes. You're perfect for it.
Thank you to Richard Rayner, and let's thank all our readers this evening. And that concludes our reading for the evening. We want to thank Jennifer Ramos, the staff here at Book Soup, for the use of their facility. We hope that they'll have us back. We also want to thank Corey, our cameraman. Thanks very much. We encourage you, everybody, go to YouTube, USC, MPW, look for the readings, and be sure to like USC, MPW on Facebook. Tell all your friends to do the same. And thanks for coming out this evening. The snacks are right back there. Eat everything. The restrooms are open now, but if you go in there, do not lock it and then close the door, or we'll be back in the same situation. All right, and the restroom's right back there. Thanks, everybody, for coming out this evening.